Okay, finally, we are on. We were experiencing some very delayed technical difficulties here, and I could not get my computer to go faster. I think I've solved the problem now, and hopefully we can get on. I apologize for being about 10 minutes late, but I think I've got what was causing it to lag so much out of the way now. Hello to everybody. We have our comment line up, but we're going to be going to Hebrews chapter 11 for our service tonight. And hello to Phyllis Bennett, who's just joined us. And I hope some more join in. I have 7 people on the side. Rhonda Greganis is watching. Elizabeth Kellum says hi. And it's good to have you. I know Cookie said she was going to be watching from the television. Shonda Birdsey is here. Hello to you, Shonda. And uh, excuse me. And we're going to be looking at Abraham some more. So if you want to turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12, that's where we're going to be going. And I'm going to be looking at some more things with Abraham tonight. We looked at Abraham's call last Wednesday, and I want to look at what Abraham did with that call and the story that goes from there. So I'm going to turn to Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm going to read I'm going to start back and read something that we read last week. So I want to start back at verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. So I want to take, since we looked at verse 8 last week, how he was called to go out to the place and he went out. I want to look at verse 9, what happened on his trip. So by faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country. I'm going to go today with part of that journey to that land of promise. And in Genesis chapter 12, what I'd like to do is start with where Abraham or Abram, remember his name hadn't been changed yet. I want to start with where Abram left and got out of his country and went into, we're going to start first with his travels. Well, we're not going to start, we're going to get all the way to his travels into Egypt. And they're going to go to the land of Canaan, and then they're going to go to Egypt. So what I want to do right now is read Genesis chapter 12, and I'm going to start at verse 4. And I'm going to read verses 4 to the end of that chapter. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the tabernacle tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeys going on still toward the south. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here's your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So let's go back up to verse 4, and let's talk a little bit about here, about what we read here. So I've got Wendy Wade has also come in. Good to have you with us, as always, Wendy. And I see that our number has increased and the number of people watching. Welcome to each one of you. So let's talk about what we see here with Abram in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. The very next verse after God told Abram what to do, Abram did it. In verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. That says a lot. He didn't wait, he didn't argue, he departed. How different he was than Moses, who argued with God later on when God told him to do something, told him to go lead his people out of Egypt. How different that is than even myself sometimes, and the rest of you maybe, when we argue with God and we don't want to do something. But Abram didn't do that. He departed. He did as the Lord had spoken to him. And interestingly, he takes with him Lot. Lot is Abram's brother's son. So Abram is his uncle, and Lot is Abram's nephew. I want to move that just a little bit. Okay. Lot is Abram's nephew, and he takes Lot with him. Was this a mistake by Abram, later Abraham? Well, it there were some bad things that happened because he took Lot with him. We see they no sooner get down there than Abram has to rescue Lot because some people came and kidnapped him, and we'll hopefully get to that story. And then later on, we know that Abraham's intervention could have saved Sodom and Gomorrah. Were there 10 people at least that were righteous in the cities? Lot going with Abram did turn out to be a mistake on his part, in that he lost his sons-in-law, he lost his wife, he lost his, well, we could say integrity, in that he was drunk. And this again is another story where we have the countries of Moab coming from. And Lot really did make some mistakes along the way. Exactly what the purpose and whether it's good or bad, we just see that Lot went with him. We see Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Excuse me. And there is some, I want to say, fussing by some of the people who don't believe the Bible, that here is a contradiction. Here's a contradiction between Abram being 75 years old and what we see in Genesis chapter 11, where Terah was 70. I'm going to go to there now. I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 11. If you want to look with me, I'm going to try. Let me go to Genesis chapter 11. Let's go to this genealogy. We see in verse 24 of Genesis 11, Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah. the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren; she had no child. Now, here's where people like to complain. Uh, Looking at the math, it wouldn't look like it would add up to Abram being 75 when he left Haran, with Terah living 205 years and him dying. On down, we see, I didn't get to that part after all. Let's go to verse 31. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter in law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go up to the land of Canaan. They came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. I want to point out something interesting in verse 26. Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is a case where we see someone with their years being given, and not one, but three sons' names being given. Very well could be that Terah lived 70 and then begat one of the three, and then the other of the three, the other two later after, because we have three of them here. Just because Abram's name is first does not necessarily mean he is the oldest. We know Abraham was a prominent figure in the Old Testament, and that prominence could be the reason Abram's name is first here. Could be. But here we have the saying here 70 years. Notice that all three of these were here. It doesn't mean that he was 70 years and all three of them were born right then and there. It could be that Nahor was, or Haran here, who died first, could have been the oldest, and Abram the youngest. There could be, looking at 205 years, I believe you could do the math, about 55 years between the three boys being born. But anyway, don't let someone say, well, here's where the Bible contradicts itself, because we have Abram living, or I'm sorry, Terah living 205 years and 70, and then Abram being 75. It can work if you look at the way it is worded, that if you notice that he's given three sons there as whom he begot. So, I'm going to go back to chapter 12 now of Genesis. I just want to make a few comments on chapter 11, on Abram being 75 years old. So, when they left. Now, he took Lot again. Lot was his nephew. Lot's father passed away. Was this a good idea or a bad idea for him to take Lot? Again, there was mistakes that happened on Lot's part. Lot was a little bit of trouble. Lot could have been like a son to Abram, as his own father, Lot's own father, was passed away. We don't know how old Lot is here, so we could have their ages closer to each other than we know, closer to each other than we feel. Sometimes aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews are closer to each other's age than they are. So Lot and Abram could have been closer to each other's age. Something I don't know, but anyway, he did take Lot with him, and he did have to go rescue Lot later. And Lot did lose I hate to say this, Lot lost a lot in his travels with Abram and in the choices that he made. But looking at this now, he takes his wife, he takes Lot, all their possessions, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. We'll see later that this was a large amount. We'll see that Abraham was a wealthy man. Lot was too. They had a lot of possessions, they had a lot of people. God didn't tell them to leave everything they had. He said to leave your father's house. and get from your father's house. And he had all his possessions. He was left at liberty to take those with him. And he did. And they come to the land of Canaan. Again, as the Hebrews writer said, here's a land they're living in, yet it's not his yet. He's living in a land with a foreign people, and God has promised him that one day this landscape, these hills and valleys and plains, these will all be yours. This will be for your descendants. And so he's now living as a stranger in a different land, just like his descendants will later. But he goes through the land to the place as far as Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah. And again, the Canaanites were still in the land here. And the Lord comes to him again, and he verifies that this is the place. He says to Abram, to your descendants, I will give this land. And so what Abram does, he builds an altar to the Lord. There he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. It is interesting that this is said in this way. He built an altar to the Lord, and that's all it says. We can infer that he made a sacrifice there. The Bible is silent, and so I'm going to be silent. It would imply that Abram made a sacrifice there. It would imply that he made an offering on this altar that he built there, that would be why he built an altar to the Lord. But looking at this altar that he built to the Lord who appeared to them, very plain altar of rough stones, that would have likely been what it would have been. Large enough, though, for sacrifice to be offered. Altars were not as to be something of beauty. And remember, later on, they were never to cut the stones of the altar, but it would have little attraction in the eyes of many, but it would be approved by God. So, what do we have here when we have Abraham worshiping God in this way? First, we see that this altar was reared entirely in the honor of God. There was no self glorifying in it. It was erected as it seems as if just this spontaneous act of gratitude. Now, how different Abraham's building, or Abram at this time, Abram's building an altar is to the people who built the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was built by people who wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to get themselves a name. Abram's altar building seeks to honor God's name. And this altar that he builds in the land of Canaan, another land where idols were worshiped, here's almost an act of protest against this prevalent and surrounding idolatry. And here, as far as we can tell, is the first altar we have in Canaan, and recorded at least, to God, to the great I am, as God identifies himself to Moses. The first altar we have reared in Canaan, here that Abraham himself built. And a second thing that this altar would be, it would be an expression of Abraham's desire to acknowledge God's presence in his life, acknowledge a divine guidance in his past life. Abram found it a joy to be under the leadership of God. He was glad for God to lead him. And wherever Abraham had his tent, God had his altar. And that was something that is a testimony to the righteousness of Abraham. So many today, we, in a way, altars in the family need to be repaired, don't they? We need to sacrifice to God. We need to give to God. And in some families, there has been no setup of any type of sacrifice. And I'm not saying going and setting up an altar physically. I'm talking about the sacrifice we give of ourselves, even the fruit of our lips in worship is not being given, especially I'm seeing during this time. And here we have this altar that Abraham builds, and probably, as far as we know, uh, wasn't the first, probably wasn't the first, and wasn't the last one the land of Canaan would see. But looking at this too, this altar shows that Abram believed in an atonement, that this, there was Jesus is the propitiation for our sins. That is, he took our place. Abraham believed that there was mercy that was revealed through a propitiation, a propitiatory sacrifice. And on this altar would be offered something, perhaps a cow, a goat, or a ram, even a turtle dove or a pigeon, whatever was offered. This shows that Abram believed in atonement. And in this, he would offer sacrifice to God. Of course, for his sins, for those of his household, that would be something Abram would have done. And possibly it seems as if Abram finds God to be nearer to him through the sacrifice. And we actually see that reenacted in Calvary with Jesus Christ, don't we? That there was mercy revealed through a propitiation, through someone taking someone else's place. Abram believed this. He built an altar for this, most likely offered something on this altar. And this altar also, again, I said first it was reared entirety in the honor of God. And second, it was reared to acknowledge God's presence and guidance in Abram's life. And thirdly, it's a proof that Abram believed in an atonement of some kind. Well, fourth, this altar that he built also expressed Abram's readiness to give himself entirely to God, to consecrate himself, or make himself ready and give himself to God. Any altar that would have failed to express this would have been a mockery. And God is not flattered by an outward show of reverence. Abram's readiness in building this altar was different than later on when we see King Saul building his altar, wanting to make a great sacrifice instead of destroying the people as God had told him to do when Samuel came and told him that the kingdom would be taken from him and the terrible things that happened with King Saul. Abram's altar was not a show of outward, look at me type uh, production. And so it expressed that Abraham was ready to consecrate himself to God. It also expressed that the Abraham's faith was so that not only was God with him, but that God was going to fulfill his promise. That's the fifth thing. Not only number four, it shows that he was ready to consecrate himself entirely to God, but it showed his faith that these divine promises would be fulfilled. He was already in the land of promise, and he could leave the future to his God. And so Abram was, by rearing this altar, setting up this altar, in a way, mentally taking possession of the land for himself and for the world here for God. And here we have Abram's faith shown just by the fact that he built an altar. It's an open excuse me. It is an open confession of Abram's faith. And he does not hide the fact that here is this altar, this uh, crude looking altar, most definitely here in the land of promise. And so he gives God this altar, and he builds an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And I want to look at verse 8. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built the altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. You're going to see that we have names here of cities that don't exist yet, places that aren't named yet. Now, someone would come and say, well, here again, here's a contradiction. Oh, look at this. He's saying that he set up at Bethel, and yet Bethel's not even there yet. Remember, we'll see Bethel. We'll see Bethel in the time of Jacob. But why does it say Bethel now? Why does it say that he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel? Well, let's just look at the way we discuss things when we study history. No, from what we know that Moses wrote these books, and Moses would have lived way later than Abraham. And Moses would have been writing to the people as he wrote these, what we call the first five books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. We see this. We see that Moses wrote this way later to the people who were living in the time of Moses, which they would be after the time of Bethel and some of these other places that we listed. Well, when we study history, when I teach history, when I teach about places in Alabama, I may say that in Jasper, Alabama, Native Americans lived there and they lived in Jasper. Well, now they didn't call it that. I'm talking to the people now so that they'll know where I'm talking about. We talk about things like that all the time in history. We'll call the names of states, and we may say, say, Pennsylvania, this and this happened well before the place was called Pennsylvania. And this is what's going on in the Bible. He moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. That's written by Moses for the people there who are reading it so that they'll know where Abraham was. And you can look at maps now and you can see the general area where Abraham was still and where Ai was. These people would know. And it's written too there. When things are written, we have to remember that every writer has to consider his audience or her audience. Who is reading this? Moses' audience would have been people who knew where Bethel was, Ai was, and it would be written for them. So, no, Abram didn't call it Bethel. Don't see it called that till later. But anytime you see a name of a place in the Bible, and it occurs to you through study that the people who lived there, that wasn't called that at that time, look and see who wrote it. And look at the time period of the people who wrote it. And see if they're writing to people who would understand it by its contemporary name. And that's why we have Bethel, that's why we have Ai, and we have places that well, Bethel especially, might not have been there or were not called that when Abram was there. So we see trouble in verse 10. So let's go on to verse 10 and the verses following. Now, a famine comes in the land. Abram goes down to Egypt to dwell there. And this famine is severe. So on his way down there, he tells Sarai, his wife, something that is really bad, okay, for several reasons, and we'll get over that. He says, I want you to tell them you're my sister. They're going to say, if you're my wife, they're going to kill me and they're going to let you live. So please say that you're my sister for my sake. Please, help me out that I may live because of you. And apparently, she did that because in verses 14 and 15 and 16, she's taken to the house of Pharaoh. How degrading it is for us to think now that this mother of faith is taken to a harem to live with the women of Pharaoh, and yet there she is. I like this about the Bible. The Bible tells the good and the bad of all of its characters. Now, we studied Noah. Noah's in the list on Hebrews 11. What did Noah do right after the flood? Went and got drunk. Went and got drunk and lay there exposing himself. What does Abram do when he gets down into Egypt? Here comes the trouble. He tells a lie. Look at the Bible characters who are Bible heroes. And the Bible doesn't shun to tell the bad about them. That's sometimes the difference between man's writings and God's writings. We try to glorify. You can look back at some of our founding fathers in America, you'll see what we call skeletons in their closet, things they did that were not right, but those aren't put in the history books. But in God's history book, the good and the bad is put. And Abraham lied. And now let's go back before I go into this totally. Let's go back to who is who in this, okay? When we look at the genealogies of Abraham and Sarah and these people, you'll see that his wife was Sarai, and that Sarai, technically, it looks to be, when you look at the genealogy, sort of a half sister or a stepsister or half sister of some kind. When he said she is my sister, and he stopped there, that was the lie. In one way, she was. But they got down there, and exactly what Abram feared happened. They saw Sarah, and Sarah did. So, Abram lied with Sarah. Sarah did too. They saw her, and she was taken to Pharaoh's house. And if you look at verse 16, where it says he treated Abram well for her sake, he had sheep, oxen, and it lists a bunch of things here. This looks almost to be a dowry. I don't know what else it would be. All these things: donkeys, servants, camels, oxen, these types of things in this day and culture would have been given in exchange for a wife. And so he would have given these to Abram, thinking these are brother and sister, and I'm just going to pay and have her with me. Now, that didn't sit well with God, because God plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. And exactly what happens between verses 17 and 18, how the Lord plagues Pharaoh, and then it somehow dawns on Pharaoh, or Pharaoh is told, or somehow he finds out, or maybe God told him. Some way it comes to him that he is not dealing with a brother and sister. He is dealing with a husband and wife. We don't know exactly what the plagues were, but Josephus says something on this, and I want to read what Josephus says on these plagues that were sent to Pharaoh. And when we talk about Josephus now, we're just talking about a historian. So he could only write from what his sources were. He was not divinely inspired, but he does say this. He said God's plague upon Pharaoh was a serious physical disorder, a distemper, and also a sedition against his government. Whereupon he inquired of the priests how he might be freed of such calamities, and they told him that they were due to the wrath of God caused by his taking the stranger's wife. Now, the stranger would be, of course, Abraham. Now, evidently, something of this nature happened, and that he asked somebody or something, and they link everything back to, hey, this started happening when we took this stranger that's coming through the land, when we took his wife. Something clicked with them, and exactly what happens between 17 and 18 that he does know, we have to be silent. And he asks, what is this that thou hast done? What is this that thou hast done? Now, I said that I'm not going to ask a bunch of questions on here because, well, I was talking with Cookie and she wanted to watch it on TV, but I do want to ask you this one question. And we have people who we haven't talked to each other a lot, so let's do something here. One other person was asked this question identically. Who else was asked, what is this that thou hast done? If you know the person, I will let you say something here. If you're at home, turn and talk to each other in your family, discuss. Who else was it that God, or I'm sorry, not God, that other people, other men asked him, it was a man, what is this that thou hast done? The same wording. Anybody want to take a guess and put that up here? I give you a minute to talk about it, then I'm going to tell you. Okay. Of whom else was it asked identically, what is this that thou hast done? It was asked of Abraham or Abram when he lied about Sarah, and that was found out. What is this that thou hast done? So I'm going to wait and see if anybody posts anything. Okay, Elizabeth has given an answer. Anyone else want to give an answer? Of whom else was it asked, what is this that thou hast done? In fact, when we discuss who it is, you'll see a bit of similarity in the circumstances. A bit of similarity. Any more want to guess? Who else did they say, what is this? I'm sure there's some people screaming it at the TV because they know they're not able to. That's fine. Okay. So I got one answer out of it. Sorry, it was wrong. It was not Moses. It was Jonah. They said the same thing to Jonah. What is this that thou hast done? Remember when Jonah went and this is in Jonah chapter 1, verse 10, that he tells him he was trying to escape God, and this caused the calamity on the seas, and they're in the boat, and everything is stormy. They've thrown off all their cargo, nothing is helping the ship. And he tells them, and they're like, what is this that thou hast done? Well, the same question was asked. If you want to connect those two between here in Genesis chapter 17, chapter 12, verses 17 through 19, Genesis 12, 17 through 19, and connect that to Jonah chapter 1, verse 10, you have the same question asked. And almost verbatim, same language that the sailors asked to Jonah in Jonah chapter 1, verse 10. So here's Abram. He's in trouble. Pharaoh gets on to him while we think on this old and aged father of the faithful, all wise. He made a mistake here, and he is rebuked for it. And he's reprimanded, and not only that, he's banished out of the country. He sends them away. So he tells him, "You told me she was my sister, so I took her. I took her to be my wife. So you take her. You go your way. You get out of here. In other words, go." Because all this trouble that's been caused is by you lying. And so when he tells Abram this, look what Abram says. Nothing. What could he say? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her. And Take her and go your way. There's nothing Abram can say about that. Okay, yeah. Sometimes when it's all the shots have been called, there's nothing to say. Do like Abram, say nothing. You did wrong. Here's the punishment. Take her and go. Banishment was a common punishment throughout the ages. Many times we picture, especially in smaller kingdoms like we have here in the Holy Land and even up in Europe in the medieval times, banishment was a more common punishment than death or torture chambers or things like that. Just get them out of the country. If they come back in, they're in trouble, but just kick them out, leave, go. And so he takes Sarah and he goes his way, and Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. And this seems to be almost a military escort. This is viewed as a military escort to either do several things. One, make sure Abram goes and gets out. He's not he's not going to be left alone to leave. He's going to be escorted out the door. And to give him safe passage. We don't know exactly what these plagues were. I gave Josephus's knowledge on it. But Pharaoh and his house were plagued. It could have been that it affected more in the country. I don't know. These plagues, long before Egypt was plagued by another Pharaoh, when Moses tried to get him to let the people leave. This Pharaoh, interestingly, is kicking them out. And later on, the other Pharaoh did too. And we'll look and see that this is prophetic of that later. But here, out of all of these stories, we we have Abram doing this, and we'll come later in Genesis chapter 20, where Abraham does almost the same thing. And you know what? His son Isaac does it's about the same thing in Genesis 26, verses 7 through 11. And looking at all of this, it seems as if Abraham's ways have seeped into Isaac's ways. We have to be careful as parents because of that. And if Abraham did this twice, well, Isaac would know about it. Isaac would have heard about it, and he would try it too. And looking at this here is God watching out for him as well, and not letting Pharaoh execute him for tricking him like this. But I believe Pharaoh was scared because he saw that this was the hand of God. Now that brings us to Genesis chapter 12, to the end of that chapter, and to the lessons we can learn from that chapter. We're going to go in chapter 13 next week when Abram leaves Egypt and everything that he has, and apparently even things that Pharaoh gave him. We'll see how wealthy he is and all of this. And also, we're going to see some more with Lot when we study our next lesson on Abraham. Now, I have enjoyed being with you on this study of Abram, our father of the faithful, and looking at some things that he did that we can copy, some things that he did that we cannot copy. Let me say this on that. We see that neither Noah nor Abraham nor Moses, none of these men were able to be that sacrifice for our sins because they themselves sinned. Jesus didn't sin. Jesus is our sacrifice. And so we have a difference between Abraham and Jesus right here in this story. And so the Bible tells us the good, it tells us the bad of its characters. Well, this is our lesson tonight. on Abraham. I can hear that something's got my dog set off to barking, and that could be anything from a deer walking by, a cat out in the woods, or somebody. I don't know, but either way, they're all riled up. But I appreciate you joining in with us. Let's remember those in our prayer requests. Let me say this about Joanne. I put on Facebook about her. They have all but ruled out that it was a stroke, and they believe it may have been something to do with her heart. I have not put another update on Facebook because I don't have an update because not all the tests are back that they're doing yet. I appreciate the kind words you said about her and praying for her, and so does her daughter Janice. Her daughter Jenny is quite sick. Her daughter Janice mentioned that too. And let's remember this whole family in your prayers. Remember all those in her prayer requests. Does anybody else have any prayer requests they would like to put into the comment section? Remember Cookie in your prayers. I got to talk to her just before we went on live. She was, I believe she was out walking. She was doing good there. Remember Mary Lou. Let's see who all else is on our prayer list. Let's remember every one of them. Does anybody have any more? I'll give you a minute or two. Uh, Remember Earl as well. Don't know any details, but just know that Earl needs our prayers, Earl Dobbins, and keep that family in your prayers. Cannot think of any more to say. I'll think of three after I get off, but just remember those that are on our prayer list, and I like to get them here, and then we'll already have them Sunday. Anybody else have a prayer request they want to put into the chat box? Oh, yes. And this is a prayer, I guess it's a prayer of thanks, a prayer of congratulations. Justin is graduating Friday night. Justin Wallace, congratulations, Justin. I hope you're watching. Graduation Friday night. This has been a long, longed for dream of this class, especially now with what's been going on. They're going to get to graduate, and we're thankful for that. Uh, Question is Stinson home yet? I have not heard that he is. Whether he is or not, I'll go ahead and put him on our prayer list, though. Okay, uh, keep Stinson Ellenberg in your prayers. Be good to see him again, won't it? He's been through a lot for our country, so let's remember him in our prayers. Anyone else? Joanne, her daughter Jenny, my student whose grandmother wanted her put on this prayer list. Abby Higginbotham, she had her knee operated on, and she's on crutches, and a little bit hard for her to maneuver on those things. So remember her in your prayers, please. Abigail, or Abby, we call her Abby Higginbotham. I can't think of any more. But anyway, so good to be with everybody. And if you will, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we can be together. And we thank you for the avenue of prayer. Father, help us to learn what we need to learn from Abraham and use it in our lives and not do the bad, but the good. And Father, we ask you to be with us when we meet again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, as far as we know now, 11 o'clock Sunday morning at the building. Another short service like we had last time. We're going to go in there, taking the communion first again. So you need to it's important you be there on time because the communion is in open cups. We took a cup and put the bread in, a cup and put the grape juice in it and stacked it. And we need to get there on time. I'm going to do the communion first, and then we'll have our singing, do the other items of worship, and be ready to do that. I hope to see a bunch of you there. Until then, may God bless you all. Have a good week.